Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third and final day of the virtual book launch of the CyCon proceedings. I'm Henrik Beckvart.
And I am Liina Lumiste. Hopefully, the final day will be as interesting as the previous ones.
Just as before, you are more than welcome to send in questions to the speakers and also to share your ideas on social media using the hashtags on our webpage, CyCon 2020 or CCDCOE.
But not to keep you more from the tech discussions, we shall now give the floor to the moderator and panelists of the first session of the day. It is our pleasure to welcome, as the moderator and CCD-COE ambassador, Dr. Bernhards Blumbergs from Latvian CERT.
Good afternoon, good morning, good day, and good evening across the whole cyberspace. This year's CyCon is the proof that cyberspace has no borders. We are already expanding beyond the borders of the future. Although the SpaceX Dragon final accreditation yesterday showed that we still do not control the weather. In this session, together with our distinguished speakers, we are going to explore the 2020 vision towards the next decade and the security challenges of the critical infrastructure and industrial control systems from the perspectives of technology, governance, and cyber conflict. Thank you, CyCon, for saving the best for the last. Welcome to the Technology Day. Before we dive into the session, I would like to introduce some house rules. In due time, I will introduce our distinguished speakers. We will initially start with 2 accepted paper presentations, 15 minutes each. This will be immediately followed by the discussions. And of course, please use the chat button and social media to submit your questions for us. I would like to introduce the first speaker for today, Major Campos. He serves in Brazilian Army, currently working in Strategic Management Department of the Cyber Defense Command. He holds a master's degree in computer systems and certifications in cybersecurity and industrial control system security. Major Campos supervises important strategic defense projects in Brazil and is one of the coordinators for the Cyber Guardian exercise. Major Campos, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Morning, everyone. I'm Major Campos. It's a pleasure to be representing my country, the Brazilian Cyber Defense Command, in this panel to present the work where the cybersecurity challenge of electrical power system of the future. Next slide, please. We are sure that the partnership of different sectors of Brazil, a product of the article, helped in the elaboration of the work with a multidisciplinary vision. Next, please. The factors responsible for recent changes in EPS are often grouped under so-called 3D views: digitization, decarbonization, and decentralization. Protecting key elements such as SCADA systems, operators, and communication networks will no longer be sufficient, as an increasing number of new small agents will being to play active roles in EPS in a smart grid scenario. We have the inclusion of new layers of agents in the structure of EPS. Long-standing EPS actors such as utility companies, customers, operators, regulators that can be classified as the first layer of agents. The second layer would cover new classes of agents that are beginning to participate in the electrical energy system, such as distributed microgenerators, electrical vehicles, and storage units. Third layers agents would include, among others, association of agents from the previous layers. And the fourth layers include service providers for agents associations. Large-scale attacks against thousands or millions of them can lead to EPS and chaos due to the increased dependence of EPS on these small agents. Please, next slide. The growing interdependence between critical infrastructure such as EPS and communication networks increase the vulnerabilities and complexity of cyber defense planning. In the EPS of the future, the increase in cyber vulnerabilities, attack surfaces, severity of the attack effects, and the feasibility of remote attacks without immediate response to attackers are likely to reinforce the motivation for cyber attacks. War, terrorism, vandalism, and different brands of radical activism are some common motivation for cyber attacks that could aim to cause a large-scale shutdown of electricity. In addition, we still have two new successful criminal business models may appear at any time. Next slide, please. This new scenario was studied in deep, and as a proposal of the article, we defined the 80 challenges that must be faced in order to prepare to establish a satisfactory level for EPS protection. It's clear that there are many other challenges, but we believe that these challenges indicate in our work that involves process, people, and technology that indicated what would be the most important. It is important to highlight they are not exclusive. They are not in order of hierarchy, and they should be treated systematically, cybersecurity framework wielding a strategic planning. Next slide, please. The first challenge is to rethink the hard cybersecurity approach. This approach employs essential cybersecurity tools, but they are not enough for EPS. If they fail, and sometimes fail, some critical elements of the system may be left unprotected. Cybersecurity policy and strategies must consider the importance of availability and adequately address the association side effects. To avoid these uncomfortable and dangerous situations, design should consider the ease of replacing components in the design phase. Another characteristic of EPS is that they generally depend on extensive and poorly monitored communication networks. Other strategies, they are not specific to EPS, but are specifically relevant in this context, as the early detection of potential dangerous behaviors. Honeypots and honeypots designed for real-time control environments can prevent attacks and produce statistics that help refine cybersecurity that can help identify suspicious behavior. With regard to the soft cybersecurity approach, we should note the inclusion of new layers of agents in an EPS system, which will begin to play active roles. Many agents will begin to operate autonomously in energy system. It can be assumed that some of them will behave in ways that could harm other agents or the entire system, and it's useful to identify them. In society, social mechanisms such as reputation trust reduce the influence of participants who are not behaving properly. Reputation assessment systems, despite some imperfections, have proven to be effective in motivating agents to behave well and identify those who do not. The most appropriate definition of trust for EPS in decision trust, we present two work associated with this term in our paper, which has as a concept. Trust is the extent to which one party is willing to depend on something or somebody in a given situation with a feeling of relative security, even though negative consequences are possible. The application of concepts of trust and reputation in the upper layers of future EPS, where thousands or millions of different entities with different capacities and objectives will interact. Due to the large number of variables still undefined today, it's debatable an initial effort to develop attempts at realistic simulations. However, it's likely to the overall behavior of the system will benefit from research in this area. Next slide, please. High-level coordinator actions are essential components of the defense strategy against some types of cyber attacks. The engagement of different sectors of society helps to build a robust cybersecurity community capable of the exchange experiences and good practices, and establish protocols for sharing information in cooperative work. This can be essential in crisis situations with the objective of developing the necessary skills in decision makers under normal conditions. There are several joint exercise initiatives around the world, such as Cyber Europe, Cyber Persel in Portugal, Europe Crisis in Germany, and the Cyber Guard in Brazil under the coordination of Cyber Defense Command. The evolution of EPS in the coming decades and their emerging cybersecurity challenge discussed in this paper will need to be gradually included in this exercise. Effective EPS cybersecurity governance should earlier cover government, defense, EPS-related agents, and other critical infrastructure sectors, customers, utilities, private sector's representatives, academic sector, and societies at all. The digital resilience of EPS, which is the primary objective of EPS cybersecurity, should gradually be brought to the same level of relevance as the security of EPS energy supply or electrical operation stability. Structures are also required for the certification of product and service of interest to EPS, including concern about cyber risks caused by 5G. Such measures can help improve the cybersecurity of current EPS. However, they are insufficient to meet all future needs. The cybersecurity governance of the new layers of autonomous agents is an open question that deserves special attention. Next slide, please. It can already be a challenge for EPS companies to identify and protect all of their critical assets. It can depend on vast, distant, and complex global supply chains. However, the problem is compounded by the increased degree of digital interconnect with other companies, because concern about cybersecurity can be as different as the companies themselves. For this scenario, it's recommended due diligence of the connection points with other companies, as well as the definition and application of adequate standards to be followed by all parties. And consider that in some countries, the purchase, sales, division, and merger of EPS companies are routine. A well-planned cybersecurity due diligence strategy would help to provide an assessment process. Extend due diligence strategy to the new layers of EPS agents is a challenge that will likely need to rely on defining good, specific connection patterns. Regarding the staff awareness and training, IT, it is important to highlight the priorities of corporate IT team in relation to cybersecurity can differ greatly from those that work in real-time operation teams in this kind of system. And the lack of mutual knowledge about the other environment brings difficulties and risks. The growing connection between the IT and OT environment makes it essential to bridge the gap between their respective cybersecurity teams. The development of the adequate awareness and qualification plans for IT and OT professionals must address the gap, but it requires a common curriculum. Next slide, please. Effective cyber exploits are monetized and sold in specialized markets, and threat agents who lack the technical skills necessary to create specific tools can now purchase the desired features and hire additional developments. The development of threat intelligence as service using methodologies such as data mining, machine learning can help EPS agents to identify, mitigate, and prevent attacks. This service can be leveraged by national and supranational cybersecurity centers and based on an international collaborative environment. An important support for an EPS threat intelligence network will be use of distributed SCADA, HoneyNets, and honeypots. That relevance is expected to increase, and despite the development and monitoring costs involved, they deserve more attention than they have received so far. Research and development activities are essential in rapidly evolving technological domains, such as cybersecurity. This is even more evident in the case of EPS, where the physical system itself is changing. Some important research topics specific to current or future EPS needs, as soft cybersecurity, SCADA nets, monitoring and motivation for attacks, visualization tools for situational awareness, and others. Next slide, please. Early actions can prevent the development of chaotic and insecure environment that resembles to the internet. In this paper, an exhaustive list of predictable impending structural changes in EPS is presented and discussed from a cybersecurity perspective, including the resulting risk and possible approach to mitigate them. But predicting accurately all future structural transformation of EPS and related and new cybersecurity change that needs, it's a very difficult task. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Major Campos. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you for paving the ground for our upcoming speaker. I would like to introduce our second speaker, Michael. Currently in the governmental role, has 20 years of practical experience with IT and industrial security. He's one of the leading experts in the realm of industrial control system honeypot deception technology, and has been credited for finding and responsibly disclosing more than 15 previously unknown zero-day vulnerabilities. Michael, all the bytes and pixels are yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the floor, and thank you very much to the previous presenter for mentioning honeypots. It's always a favor to see that, because for various reasons, honeypot is a very important layer of defense that is not always being utilized, and especially not within industrialized security, and that's actually a shame. I would like to present this paper. And it has been, first of all, I would like to send thanks for being allowed to do the presentation. And I would also like to send a special gratification to my co-auditor, Michael Dobston, who had actually been doing all the heavy lifting of this paper. And I created some of the data. Big thanks to Mr. Dobson and to his professor, Mr. Pattinson, both from University of Cambridge. Next slide, please. Just as mentioned in the introduction, for the last 6 years, I've been working with critical infrastructure within, especially like power, oil and gas, and manufacturing. As mentioned, I've done a lot of responsible disclosure, and it actually started 6 years ago in a search for actually finding reliable threat intelligence regarding attacks on ICS, and especially on ICS who, for whatever reason, was faced on the internet. We think this paper is very interesting, to the best of our knowledge. It has the largest data set and the longest period ever yet been presented in an academical paper. If I could have the next slide, please. Yeah. One of our keystones in investigating was that given that we would deploy high-interaction honeypots, and a honeypot is just a fake device, and high-interaction just based that it looks and feels and acts the way that an attacker would expect. Basically, it means that if you're scanning like an Ethernet to serial adapter like Moxa, it actually says, yes, I am a Moxa, and yes, it replies back to the right things. But basically, when we're looking at the profiles for external attackers, besides the vendor and the disgruntled employee, you basically have 4 groups of attackers. On the vertical skill line here is like the people, how technical skills are they actually in order to find and abuse ICS equipment, and just in general, how technical are they? On the horizon, it's like, what's the motivation specific to hit our organization? Because those two parameters is quite interesting, especially when you're looking into that. So in the lower left side, you have the script kiddies. They don't have a lot of technical knowledge, and this don't necessarily have a lot of motivation in hitting our organization. Unfortunately, given the delicate state of industrial control systems, a script kiddie, or even worse, just an automated computer virus, can do a lot of really unintended damage on industrial control systems. On the right lower side, we have the e-crime. Unfortunately, crime do pays, especially on the internet. They have a lot of technical skills, but perhaps not that big kind of motivation to hit ICS equipment. Actually, they don't, because they are kind of funny things. They don't have a lot of CPUs. You cannot mine a lot of bitcoins on it, so basic's not that. Then on the upper left side, we have anonymous or similar geopolitical interest group. That's not the same thing as states, but they might not have the big technical thing, but for various reasons, they might feel very offended for what your organization. An example, if you're like in oil business and various other things, then people might be offended and want to hit your organization. And then last but not least, we have on the upper top corner, we have the state-sponsored attackers, APT, Advanced Persistent Threat groups, and basically they have a lot of technical skills and a lot of motivation. So basically we said, what is, if we are going to deploy high interaction honeypot on the network, what is actually, what kind of results are we going to see, which is what the paper is about. If I could have the next slide, please. Basically, you would, on the right side, you would see this is the normal way where you would deploy a honeypot. On a normal layer of defense, you would have a malicious host scanning from outside the internet. You would have them to breach some of your equipment. They would move laterally and do different exploitation within the enterprise network, the IT network, and then they would jump into a firewall or similar safeguards and going into the OT system. And this is definitely one of the places where industrial control honeypot shines, because that on an OT network, industrial network, traffic is very predictable. It's not suddenly that host XYZ starts to do scanning and doing a lot of different things. We had considered this, and in certain cases we actually had a small setup of a real equipment, but most of the honeypots was deployed in one out of two ways. One of them was this: you had a malicious host, and then it was the honeypots, and on that network it might either have like real PSC equipment, it might have the infamous Moxie converter, or other things. So basically there was various places of doing deployment. If I could have the next slide, please. Oh, I think you went one, two. I think you. Oh, in that, no, no, let's just go ahead. Next slide, please. Sorry. Basically, when we're talking about the honeypot, just imagine that very often we hear the mantra that the attackers just need to get it right once. We need to, as a blue team, as a defender, we need to be right every times. But just imagine for everyone who do red team attacking, when you're breaching a network, very often you wouldn't know anything about it. So the first thing you would normally do is that you're going to exploit the network, you're going to make reconnaissance and actually to find out what's actually on that network. And when you're doing that, you're making a lot of noise. So basically, the whole idea is that when you're making noise, when you start to interact with a honeypot, then we as a defender know that this is somebody is attacking us, and we can respond accordingly. So it's just about, you know, changing the game and changing the rule. Next slide, please. Yeah, in most cases, the way we deployed the network, in total we had more than, we had 120 sensors, and that was when people were starting to scan. Then basically the scan one or more IP address, and that was being rerouted or proxied in technical speaking into either really high very believable simulations or even the real thing. So basically, you could scan one IP address in one country, and then you would be under the impression that you was interacting with the real equipment. You was, but however, you could scan an IP address, in example, let's say Ukraine or in the US, and then find out that this IP address is actually unknowing to the attacker was being rerouted into a data center located in Scandinavia. And that would be the same thing as whenever people was poking at IP addresses in Russia and vice versa. So basically, that was all being collected. So it also gives the look and the feel that this was actually the real equipment. And then in certain cases, we was having like this built-in template. So yeah, if I could have the next slide, please. Yeah, so basically in this case that would be the proxy. This is very most important because as mentioned that on the honeypot you have all within the honeypot it say, okay, if you're scanning for this port, in example, if you're scanning for port TCP 502, which is the Modbus, then I should reconnect you into a real Modbus device. And a little quick word regarding the services or the protocols we've been choosing. Some of them is very vendor specific, but on purpose, a lot of them was not that vendor specific. In example, like services like Modbus, it's not necessarily tied down to one specific vendor. We also, from a technical point of perspective, was looking into IC 104, which is within electric grid. And last but not least, we also, in order to ensure that it was believable, but this is a very important part of the honeypot setup in all, we also make sure that certain protocols like the DNP3 standard, which is only used in the US, wasn't to be found in one of the honeypots who was based, in example, in Europe. If I could have the next slide, please. So basically, the thing about the honeypot is that, first of all, there would be no reason whatsoever that people was trying to attack our misconfigured ICS equipment on the internet. But besides that, then in normal circumstances in the layer defense strategy, then you would normally say that any interaction event indicate either a misconfiguration, like something has changed, like the baseline has changed. That's not an attacker, it's just something was then a mistake. An interesting part on some of them, if that would have been an in-house honeypot, I've known a lot of cases where people actually by accident was hitting the honeypot, even it was legit people. And then last but not least, we have the attack. The cool thing about honeypot is as such you don't have any false positive. Any alert and every event should be investigated, because that's something that is anomal. It's something like out of the ordinary. If I could have next slide, please. Yeah, so a bit numbers on the paper. The paper itself, of course, described more in details, but we had it located geographical spread out in 22 countries around the world in order to avoid bias, because just having a lot of honeypots within, an example like the Scandinavian geographic wouldn't tell us about what kind of threats would there be around for other countries. In total, we were using different devices. We was at a total use 15 different physical devices, and then above that also a number of very believable simulation in order, so if you was interacting with something, it would either be the real device or it would be something that would be simulating various things. As one of the key things in this paper is also, to the best of our knowledge, it's one of the largest data set that has been used so far in an academical paper. My co-writer was very persistent in asking me to provide a lot of data, which I applied to. So we have 13 months of data. It was from March 2018 until April 2019, so it's also rather currently. We had more than 200,000 packets and flows, and we had 80,000 interactions. And last but not least, one thing that was quite interesting, that in one of our high interaction farms, when it was real equipment, we actually managed to find 4 0 days. I'm not going to go too much into details with those. Each of them has been responsible disclosed to the vendor. Each has, in certain ways, acknowledged that this was a vulnerability who was either not fixed or either not known in advance. And most of them was either denial of service, aka DOS, or buffer overflows. So each of them is currently in order to be fixed in order to have a more secure world. If I could have the next slide, please. Yeah, just a quick overview over some of the protocols as mentioned. One thing that is actually quite interesting is that when we look through the data, then it doesn't come as a surprise that a lot of them is, automated tools or known scanning tools. So primarily, or almost in all cases, it was something that we could attribute to known scanning tools, like, okay, this is Nmap, like, okay, this is Metasploit module XYZ. And this is actually also, like, the description is very consistent with previous studies that we also have been looking at. But again, the most interesting part is that when you filter out all the known actors, which is not by default evil or benign, is like when we're filtering out something like Shodan, Rapid7, Scan.io, and all the usual, then you are removing a lot of the data set, but you're still into something that's really, really interesting, because that when you have removed 95 or 99% of the data, of course, what's left is the thing who is actually quite interesting. If I could have the next slide, please. Yeah, and not only that, but also as a complement, University of was so kind, so they actually had an additional data set, which my co-author, Mr. Dobson, was getting access to. And the interesting part about that is that some of the IP addresses who were specific standing for ICS equipment was also something who specifically was scanning for Mirai and other IoT things. And that again shows, unfortunately, there's some kind of convenience between ICS and IoT. Last slide, please. Yeah, so just to sum up, you can use honeypots to identify and profile new target attacks. It goes without saying, if somebody was going specific for your organization, it would not be showed, but again, shows some value. ICS and IoT domains are converting. Some of the people are looking for one is looking for the other. And again, it was globally distributed, so that also gave us a better thing of the data. With that, I would like to say thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Michael, so much for the presentation and your marvelous work being done on the industrial control system honeypots. With this, I would like to introduce our distinguished expert. Patrick Miller has dedicated his career to the protection and defense of critical infrastructures as a trusted independent security and regulatory advisor. He's a managing partner at Archer International, as well as the founder, director, and president emeritus of EnergySec, and United States coordinator for the Industrial Cybersecurity Center. Patrick's diverse background spans the energy, water, telecommunications, and financial services. Patrick, the cyberspace is yours.
Awesome, thank you. And great presentations from the folks before me. I'm just going to give a brief piece on what I'm seeing for kind of now and the future for industrial control systems. Michael, good job on describing some of the adversaries. I like to summarize this as basically our adversaries have three things that we don't. They have people, they have money, and they have time. Most organizations and most governments don't get all three. I think an important distinction is that not all of the adversaries are nation states or terrorist groups. Remember, there are things out there like organized crime and even your competitors as well from an industrial perspective. I guess the sophistication is really one of the keys. Some of them are far more sophisticated than others, of course, but the fact is a lot of them don't have to be. We're still finding control systems on Shodan on a daily basis, and they're not always Michael's honeypots. They're actually real systems that we're still finding on Shodan all the time. The world is, at least for the industrial side, it's made up of a lot of embedded systems. these embedded systems, they're purpose-built. They basically do one thing, and they do that one thing very well. They can be environmentally hardened, for example, to operate in extreme conditions. But that's it. They're not like the IT world, of course. They're not, Windows and Unix all the time. The interfaces to them, like your human-machine interfaces are, but that kind of that industrial side of the sensors and the activators and all of these components that run our world behind it, it's all basically these purpose-built devices. They're all going digital. That's one of our bigger challenges. Is this stuff used to be everything from analog to electromechanical. They were physics-based in a lot of cases with very lightweight digital components. Moving forward, that's going to be heavily digital. Not because, well, I guess primarily because the digital stuff actually is more, it's smarter. It can do things better, but it can also be manipulated like any other digital device. The challenge, I think, with the digitization of everything is everything gets embedded. So, I mean, I know a lot of programmers, they're very smart, they're very brilliant, but they also don't want to write new code. So they'll reuse old code. And that gets embedded inside something else that's embedded inside something else that's embedded, to where we really, at this point in our digital state, we've kind of lost track of all of the kind of historical pieces. That just creates more landscape for all of the attackers, all the way down into things like compilers and, very esoteric options. So that embedded thing really is one of our key issues in terms of one of our risk components. Additionally, all of these things, as they get smarter, we're connecting them all to each other. Before, we didn't do that, right? Most of these things were effectively isolated. I hate to use the word air gap. They were more or less isolated into discrete areas. In the future, all of this will be connected to everything else. It's going to be hyper-connected in ways that the perimeter will still be there, but it will matter less, and there will be very complex relationships with other perimeters and perimeters that you don't control in a lot of cases. That's just part of our future, and that's being driven by business because the data from these systems is very, very important, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The other component is that this technology used to be like, frankly, some of these things were huge. Like, RTU used to be the size of a refrigerator. Now they're smaller and smaller, and it's really just going away. The technology is getting small enough to just be part of the fabric of the factory or the facility. The IoT and IIoT components are being built into the actual physical components that we used to not have any kind of technology in them at all. So it's just kind of going away from our sight. That makes it harder to control and harder to manage when you can't see it. And all of this has to live within an ecosystem that is basically, legacy. Some of this stuff is 20, 30, 50 years old. So they have to live side by side. This innovation that we're facing is something you really can't stop. There's a lot of folks that are trying to slow this down. Humans are going to innovate, and they're probably going to do it faster than we want, and they're going to do things that are going to disrupt us. Those of us in the industrial space are going to have to get uncomfortably comfortable with innovation because it's what's happening, and we have to basically embrace it and try to teach it good manners as early as we can. Because in reality, the data is the future. We're using data in unique and creative ways, basically in ways we never have before. And just kind of open your mind a bit to this, where in the future, we're likely going to see things, everything from, yes, cloud, yes, virtualization, yes, AI and machine learning. All of these things are going to find their way into our world. They're going to be used in ways because they're profitable. Data is worth money. Data may be worth money in ways that it's actually maybe worth more than your product at some point in the future. We may see a time when people give away electricity or other industrial components to make money off of the data about that. That's interesting, and it's going to change things. So what can we do to make this situation better? There's the immediate reaction is regulation, and I'm a recovering regulator. I've been on that side. I've seen regulation all around the globe. Overregulation can really hurt the innovation and expansion of great ideas, and can basically hamper industry, believe it or not. It creates an artificial ceiling where you say, once if I meet the regulation, then therefore I'm secure, which is actually not true in any way. Regulation, compliance and security are two different things. You shouldn't fear the auditor more than you fear the attacker, right? So that's where we need to change the mindset of making this a good business decision, because it's basically good for your business. You know, reliability and uptime is good for you, and security enables that. Security also enables safety in our world. Without security, you don't really have safety or reliability of your operation. So thinking about it differently from a regulation perspective, light touches, market forces, those kinds of things can really help. What you're trying to do is not prescribe just action, but trying to motivate attitude with regulation. Be careful there. One of the last pieces is supply chain. Everyone likes to immediately run to supply chain. We're seeing like frankly, a balkanization of everything. Really understand made in a country really just means assembled in that country. We don't have a situation where any country can make everything literally on their own soil from start to finish. It just doesn't exist anymore. So let's look at things like global transparency initiatives and how do we get something where we can still operate in ways, because the market drove us to this point where we are now. Let's use that to our advantage and find ways to actually work together with some transparency options so we can continue down this path without isolating each other and making the problem worse. The key issue is dependency. We are dependent on our industries. They make all of the things that we use. They run our water, our lights, our oil, everything about our transportation systems. All of this industrial stuff we're heavily dependent on. It is also heavily dependent on technology. It isn't like iPhones and TVs where you change it all out all the time, but it does change. I think the interesting part is we've got to get back to understanding the gravity of making changes in these environments at that speed. It's going to go faster, it's going to be uncomfortable, but that's still got to be balanced and measured. That approach has to embrace what we really wouldn't consider just all this preventive measures. You still have to do prevention, but it's more about resilience. So you are likely going to see some sort of attack, you know, if you're not already, you know, if they haven't already hacked you and you just don't know about it. That basically means focus more on resilience than security. How do you operate through an attack? How do you operate through ransomware on your plant floor? What can you do? Do you know enough about your system to operate manually? Have you tried? This doesn't just happen by luck or chance or hope. This requires the system to be designed for that, and it's got to have prepared people for it. So practice, and you don't necessarily need a million new security widgets. You can actually use what you have if you know how to use it well. Humans are very creative in those situations, and having practice with the tools that they have can be very beneficial. So they'll end on the note of focusing on resilience and security to enable things like, you know, frankly, business optimization and reliability and safety. Back to you, Bernhard.
Thank you, Patrick, so much for forward-looking introduction into what we would expect into the upcoming future. Actually, as you already clearly stated, we don't have to wait until the future starts in an unknown time ahead. It is already here, and we are already ramping up and really rushing towards the future and bringing all the technology that we have with us into the future and building on top of it. I would like to start with the first question I have, but I will address it to Major Campos. Yes, and this is of course going to be addressed to the rest of the panelists as well. Initially to Major Campos. So your papers is focusing on electrical power grids, and I fully agree. We are dependent on electrical power. Everything is kind of dependent on it. But are we ready? Are our infrastructures resilient enough to withstand the attacks and external offensive cyber operations? Are we there yet? What are the steps that we need to take? And is decarbonization, digitalization, and decentralization that your paper talks about a viable solution for securing the future of the energy sector? Major Campos.
Yeah, this scenario will be a trend and will bring great benefits to society, but we must look at the challenges to be faced. If you bring it to the reality of a smart grid, for example, where the layered approach allows the actor to interact with the system, the attack surface will grow exponentially. And just the most friendly part, with little maturity in cybersecurity, will be more susceptible to this type of approach. We do not expect many changes in the first layer of agents, that is, utilities, operators, large customers. But other layers, which are most relevant today from the cybersecurity point of view, will gradually become critical for the appropriate operation of the system. Millions of new agents, small agents, will start to operate actively in the electric power system, each one in search with its own interests and with no regard to general system. The environment on which those agents will operate tends to be much less secure than the scale environment. And these agents will potentially be in contact with huge numbers of other agents. In summary, we can expect an increase in these risks related to the first layer, but the range of motivation will not change much, except if the new business models, for example, for attacks appear.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Patrick, do you have your viewpoint on the decarbonization, digitalization, and decentralization? Are these potential solutions for ensuring our resiliency?
Yeah, I think we can do this. There's a lot of technologies out there that do a very good job. I think the hard part is just knowing what you have and knowing how to protect it. None of these things that we're introducing are frankly really new. I mean, none of this stuff is like something we've never thought of before or is alien in nature. It's just more of it. So how we deal with it is more of a scaling problem than it is a new issue with an unaddressable solution. So I think done well, yes, this can be done. It's more how do you scale to the level of where every single thing in your environment creates a data stream and has a connection to everything else. So that requires your capabilities to respond and scale accordingly. And could you do things like break sections of it off to protect or isolate threats? So all of those things you would typically do on a small scale, you just got to do that on a much larger scale in a much more complex environment. But yes, it can be done.
Right. Thank you. Now, Michael, your work that you contributed as a co-author and the data set came from your HoneyNet. Now, what was the approach that you took when analyzing and processing the data, or maybe not directly you, but the other authors of the paper? Could you please a little bit elaborate on this?
Yeah, sure, because that everyone and a lot of security vendors like to say that they have X million trillions of attack each and every day. So basically, we took the data set and look into it. Okay, based on the list that both our organization maintain on known scanners, aka like Shodan, IOC, whatever your opinion goes, those kind of services organization, they're actually they're not truly evil. They are not evil. They're just exposing what people have chosen, either knowing or unknowingly, on the internet. So first of all, we took that data and left that because we said, well, Shodan might be scanning, they might using known IoT commands like using Modbus in order to say, hello Modbus, what kind of device are you? So we took that out. And then when we have weed that out, then of course the remaining data, that was when it was starting to get really interesting. Because very often we had like one IP address, fully automated scanning for something. All right, then it went away.
Right, but if I may intervene, if I may intervene, Mike. So just from my perspective, the attackers will anyway use the Shodan or any other system that kind of automatically scans. And in your talk, you said that you would rather take those data sets or the streams out of the data set. Wouldn't that already kind of minimize the actual scope and the visibility of the actual malicious attacks?
Yeah, but that's the key word. That's on malicious, because in our view, Shodan itself is not malicious. They're not trying to exploit the ICS equipment we're putting up. They want to interrogate them, they want to query them, but in essence, they don't want to do something evil by themselves. But then with the smaller subset, it was just suddenly possible to do even more interesting analysis. Like in example, you could see certain IP address in example Vietnam was always scanning what seems to be a building management system in Russia. But that specific IP address never, ever scanned the similar system in the US or in UK or the one who was based in South America. So
Right.
that was some of the interesting. Yeah.
Right. That is absolutely good explanation for this. The question that I would like to direct to you, and then afterwards to the rest of the panel, is now your work and your entire career is about disclosing and uncovering the 0 days. Now, is there a need to change the disclosure policies or processes that we currently use for ICS-related vulnerabilities, in essence 0 days, such as like Google's 90-day full disclosure policy? Would this be applicable to industrial control systems?
Well, I can say yes, we need to change it, but going the Google way is definitely not the correct way to do it. During my career, when I have done responsible disclosure to a lot of both very small, well-known vendors and smaller vendors, the 90 days would no way give them any fair chance in order to fix it. Of course, it comes down to the maturity of the vendor itself, but very often they need to come up with a solution, and perhaps there might be other things to consider. And last but not least, very important is they also need to ensure that whatever update they're doing in order to fix whatever vulnerability I have found don't break other stuff or other services in their product. And that is a time-consuming thing. I have been, and I know other here in the panel as well, have been working together with vendors like 2 or 3 years in order to get this fixed. And it's not necessarily a sign that the vendor don't want to cooperate. It's just a very, very complex thing, because you don't want to make mistakes when you're rolling out a new firmware or updates and that kind. So definitely.
Absolutely, yes, I agree. This is a very, very kind of sensitive thing to run the updates and on the industrial control systems. Patrick, would you like to take a stab at this as well? Do you see from the high-level perspective of the changes in the disclosure policy?
Yeah, I'm struggling with how to make it any better than it already is. I don't know if there's an easy solution to this. You're always going to have organizations that find them, hoard them, and sell them, put them on the dark web. Organizations, whether they're nation-state organizations or non-government organizations, organized crime, and just independent researchers. There is a healthy market for this on both the legitimate market and the illegitimate market. Given the fact that there is a market for it, it will operate basically with the rules of economics. We can try to change those rules with various regulations and good practice, but in fact, it's going to likely follow standard economic behaviors. So unfortunately, there isn't an easy answer or a good answer for this. We're doing, in a lot of cases, not a great job, but I would argue maybe an okay job. It could be worse. We'll put it that way. But there's, I think, as Michael put it, the vendors, if I could make a plea to the vendors, have a front door for people to come in with vulnerabilities and, dedicate some focus to this. You're basically getting, outsourced vulnerability research on your products to make your products better, safer, more reliable. This gives you a market differentiator as being better than your competitors that don't. So consider the economic benefits of having a more secure platform and having a front door and a response team for dealing with these things. So there's a lot of complex moving parts in this, and there isn't an easy answer. But yes, we should endeavor to get better at this. Unfortunately, it's not going to be a light switch that here's your perfect solution. It's going to be rocky and strange going forward. Right, absolutely. I agree with you on this one. And taking into account your international and global experience, Patrick, would you say that have you observed any key differences between the regional approaches, such as the United States, European Union,
Asia, when actually they are trying to address the same, very same industrial control system related security concerns? Is there a difference, and how can we learn together? And is that an option? Can we share information together? Is that an option?
Yeah, of course. There are differences regionally, hemispheres, even, quarter hemispheres. This is a tough one as well to answer, because what we're finding is closing the door and not communicating is certainly not helping. We're all using the same technologies, and they're all made by the same vendors, and the manuals come in every language, and then there's Google Translate if you don't have your language there. So we have to just admit the fact that we're now a global ecosystem of technology at this point. Packets don't have boundaries. In most cases, even currency doesn't have boundaries anymore with the advent of the digital currencies. So we need to just admit the fact that it's one big happy planet at this point. That said, I would definitely endeavor to get things like global transparency initiatives and more open communication versus the opposite. And nations that isolate themselves may feel better about that, because now they're in theory, they're eliminating threats from the outside. But again, unless you can literally make everything inside your boundaries that you need for everything else, which is a challenge. Even then, what you're doing is you're now closing your eyes to all of the other innovation and bright ideas, fantastic security approaches and defensive maneuvers, and even offensive maneuvers that are happening out there in the world. It's closing your mind and closing your mind.
Right, and I would assume that running the exercises and training together, either in the nation or multi-nation, could be the one way to increase the critical infrastructure resiliency, not only the critical infrastructure, but the nation's preparedness. Major Campos, your work also in the paper and your primary work is also related to running the exercises. Do you see that these exercises do provide the benefit for resiliency, threat response, and governance, and in what way?
Yeah. It's a good approach. I think it's necessary. The exercise needs to represent a key element of the electricity sector and other sectors in a realistic way. In Brazil, we have a cyber guardian since 2017. With a telecommunications sector, financial, nuclear sector, telecommunications sector, water sector, and others. There's a structural change in the sector. In particular, the participation of countless new agents will have to be represented in some way for the results of the exercise to be valid. In this case, high-level coordinated actions are essential components of the defense strategy against some types of cyber attacks, with the directed at the EPS or embracing or the critical infrastructure. And then inter-agents join, combining the exercise should be centrally coordinated and involve different public and private partners. How it's happened in Brazil, included those sectors of the armed forces and government responsible for the cyber defense. The engagement of different sectors of society that assists in building a robust cybersecurity community capable of change experience and good practices, and establish protocols for information share and cooperative work. This may prove essential in crisis situation. Otherwise, if the exchange of base information can be difficult, the evolution of EPS of the next decade and their emerging cybersecurity challenges discussed in our session, for example, we need to be gradually included in those exercises. They will have an impact of the simulation of scenarios and cyber attacks and bring new vulnerabilities to be reproduced. Crisis management, incident response, and action plans must evolve accordingly. In Brazil, for example, as a result of the exercise, for example. Okay.
Major Campos, thank you for the point. We have time only for the last question, which I would like to ask for the rest of the panel, is for all of you on the panel, is if we're looking very far into the future, well, relatively very far in the future, what would be the sector that you would say is going to be the next target that you would foresee as a target for offensive operations or as a target for any operations, whether it be anything? So I will start with Patrick, please.
Electricity.
Electricity.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And
Thank you.
multiple studies on this. It's the hub around which all other infrastructures revolve. Without power, things go down real fast. So I would say electricity and comms, because they're woven together.
Exactly. And you already said that there's everything of hyperconnectivity that we might anticipate in the future. Michael, your take on this?
Yeah, in a good panel, you shouldn't agree with everything every other side, because otherwise I said exactly the same thing as Patrick. But I would actually say power, but also water, because water is actually in some cases very elementary, both for healthcare and actually for producing water.
And water, sewage, like water purification and cleaning facilities as well. Would that be part of it?
Yeah, that's when I said water, that would also especially mean like sewage and other things. Yes.
Clear. Thank you so much. Major Campos, I know your work focuses on the energy sector. Is there any other your favorite sector besides energy?
In my opinion, I think the combination of the electric energy and telecommunication energy, because the interdependence among these infrastructure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, our panelists, experts, honored guests. This summarizes our panel, our session. Now, we understand that the future is going to be harder, it's going to be more intertwined, and we are already there. We have to take with it and address it and live through it. And that's why we have the job. Thank you, everyone. And with this, I turn back to Ellen.
Thank you, Bernhard, and thank you to the panelists for providing us with a very interesting first session of our Tech Day. And also a huge thank you to you, the audience. Without you, we wouldn't be here today. Thank you for tuning in.
We will now have a short coffee break where you can stretch your legs or have a fresh air, and we can set up for the next session. So let's meet again at 17:15 Eastern European time.